Hello friends, in this session we can see the penetration test cases overview. Agenda: what is penetration test cases? Why penetration test cases need? How to prepare the penetration test cases? Requirements for penetration test cases, sample test cases for web application, where can be followed these penetration test preparation, and benefit of the penetration test cases artifact. So these aspects we can see today. Okay, penetration test cases overview. What is penetration test cases? Basically, it is a test procedure and step to execute the penetration test and verify whether the target systems have any security loopholes or not. So it shall include the reference requirements for the each test cases, test case description, test scenarios, test steps, prerequisite to execute the test, test tools, where to execute, what is the expectation and observed behavior of the test result. Sometimes these document also we call it as penetration test protocol document. So this is what we need to follow the penetration test cases. Why need penetration test cases? The purpose of the test cases is to determine whether all security controls and security requirements are tested and verified and recorded in the document. Sometimes these test cases shall be shared to customers or regulatory agencies to get further approvals on the certificate aspects or audit aspects or the confirmation aspects, right? So this is what we need to follow the penetration test cases. How to write the penetration test cases? While preparing the penetration test cases, we need to consider the security requirements, privacy requirements for the assets, target asset details of the system, required test cases or test scenarios need to be considered for each asset, prerequisite to execute the test, which tools we need to use to execute the test, and where to test these test steps. What is the test results, expected and observed behavior? Then the test status tested by test time, like date and time. So these inputs we need to create when we do the penetration test cases. Then requirements for penetration test cases. Security standards OWASP top 10, SANS CWE, NIST 853, CIS benchmark, OWASP ASVS, testing guides, privacy requirements, GDPR requirements for the application or system, compliance requirements like PCI DSS, HIPAA. Based on the sensitive data, we need to select the compliance requirements. Sometimes customers also will provide some specific requirements. So that requirements we need to convert into a test cases. We need to convert into a penetration test cases, and we need to execute on the target system or target assets. So this is the requirements basically we need to consider when we create the penetration test cases. We will see the sample penetration test cases for one of the web application and we can discuss further. Okay, this is one of the sample penetration test cases for web application. Here you can see two sections. One is test design penetration test cases. In this section, in the test design section, we need to identify the penetration test design inputs. Based on the inputs, we need to create the penetration test cases. So this is one of the sample web application. If you see the test design inputs, like the first input is requirements. We have the security requirements, privacy requirements, compliance requirements, right? So that requirements we need to gather. Then we need to understand the application by following the architecture. If we have the test plan, we can follow the test plan, we can get required inputs. So based on the inputs, we need to identify the test cases scope and not in scope. What are all the modules will cover by the test cases and what modules will not focus these test cases. That is scope of the test cases and not in scope of the test cases, or not tested scope of the test cases. So that aspects we need to collect. Example, if we take the scope of the test cases like web client authentication, authorization, web client session management, server side input validation, server configuration, web server to database communication, data storage, data transit, web application hardening, application and programming components, third party components, login mechanism. So these are all the modules we are considering as a scope to create the test cases. Meantime, suppose if it is not required the infrastructure and network side security, that we can keep in the not in scope details. Okay, based on these inputs, first step we need to identify the assets. Example, the web application have the modules like user provisioning, authentication management, authorization management, session management, input validation, secure configuration, application data, database, cryptographic TLS certificate, and data privacy PCI DSS. So they have data, right? So that data privacy requirements. So these modules we have, assume that these modules have in the web application. Each modules there have the assets. Assets here nothing but which we want test and protect from the cyber threats. Example, if we take the user provision, new user provision, new user registration function, new user deregistration function, user provisioning data. So these are all the assets. Thoroughly we need to test and identify whether we have enough security or not. So this is what the penetration test we need to focus and we need to create. Again, if we take the authentication management, web application login function, web login credentials, web login communication between the client to the server, these assets thoroughly we need to test and we need to identify whether all controls are implemented or not. Then authorization management, user and role configuration, privilege configurations. So these assets we need to test and we need to identify the security controls are implemented thoroughly. Session management. Suppose assume that if the web application have the JWT, then the JWT timer configurations, timer value, session timeout value, these assets thoroughly we need to test. Accordingly, we need to create the test cases to validate the session management module. Then input validation. Assume that the web application have the JSON parser on the server side and JSON data type between the server and client. So that time the JSON parser configuration, JSON data validation on the server side, HTML configuration, HTML validation, CSS configuration, CSS validation on the server side. So these aspects we need to create the test cases and we need to execute that. Secure configurations, web application, HTTP response header configurations, web client side cache, web server to API gateway configurations, log configurations, web application logs. So these aspects we need to test. Like that, the test cases we need to focus on the application data, database side, cryptographic side, TLS certificate side, and the personal data or sensitive data, how securely it is handling on the server side, client side, and when it is in the data in transit, rest, or data in use, all these aspects we need to test. So this is what the first step, we need to identify all modules and assets which we want to test and verify in the target systems. Once the assets are identified, then we need to identify the attack entry point. Suppose, assume that the web server is one of the entry point, their attackers may exploit the vulnerability, right? That we call it as one of the web server is one of the entry point. Like web client also one of the entry point for the attackers. If we have any loopholes in the web client side, they may exploit and execute further vulnerabilities. Then HTTP APIs, TLS certificate, authentication mechanism, authorization mechanism, JWT token, server side logs. So these are all the assets point. These are all the entry points. So these entry points we need to identify and we need to understand before creating the test cases. Then what tools we need to use, the tools list also we need to identify. Then once we go to the penetration test cases, based on these test design inputs, we need to create the pen test cases or penetration test cases now. Okay, once we come to the test cases area, the first we need to record reference requirement. Example, OWASP top 10 authentication requirement. So based on that, which target modules or components or assets we need to test web authentication. This is the test case ID. If for internal tracking purpose, we can create one test case for this. Then the test scenarios. Verify that the application and all APIs have strong authentication while access the APIs from the remotely. So this is one of the test scenario. To execute these scenarios, we need to create proper test procedures. Example, this is the precondition to execute the test procedure. Configure the burp suite address in browser. This is nothing but proxy configuration for burp suite. That configuration we need to provide, and we need to access the URL from the browsers which we configured the proxy for the burp suite. Then we need to log in into the URL or web client, and we need to intercept or sniff the communication between the web server and web client, right? So the communication we need to initiate. Then test steps. Once we come to the test steps, capture the traffic between the web client and server, access the APIs without authentication token or credentials. So this is what required test procedures we need to provide for the testers to execute the test cases. Okay, the next input, which tools they need to use to execute the test. Here it is burp suite. The connection type. The prerequisite of the connection type is web client browser with burp suite configuration is the prerequisite to execute the test case. Then based on the stride or attack or type of attack, based on that, this is spoofing attack we are simulating here. So the spoofing I mentioned here. Then where to test. So suppose if we take one test case, we need to execute the same test case in different entry points, right? Example, here you can see multiple entry points we have, like new user registration function, new user deregistration function, provisioning data, web login function, web login credentials, web login communication, user roles and configuration, API configuration, JWT configuration, JWT timeout value, session or connection ID, JSON parser configuration. So it's nothing but these are all the entry points attacker may exploit and execute the vulnerabilities. That points we call it as entry points. So these attack entry points where to test for each test cases. Example, if we take the first test case, we need to test in the entry point of new user registration function, new user deregistration function, web login function, API configuration. In these places, we need to test the test case 1. This is one sample reference. So accordingly, wherever is required, we can identify the entry points also and we can map the test cases. Okay, once we identify the test scenario, test cases and the entry point mapping of the test, we need to give each test case the expected behavior also. Example, the first test case, the expected behavior is web application shall validate the authentication credentials and provide access for any application resources or APIs. So this is the expected behavior and observed behavior. While we execute the test, if we identify the different behavior, we can update here. Then the test results, the test case finally is pass or fail, that details also we can mention. Then tested by signature, if required we can add the signature and date and time of the testing, and reviewer signature date. So these inputs normally we need to follow when we execute the penetration test cases. So like that we can create the test cases for web application authentication, web application data handling, web application data handling, then user registration, deregistration, web login function, web login communication, web user role. So whatever the modules or assets we identified, each assets we can create the test cases and test scenarios, and we can create the test cases and test scenarios. Accordingly, we can execute these test cases in our application, and we need to validate whether all the security controls are properly implemented or not. So this is one of the sample test cases. Once we identify the proper assets of the system or application, accordingly we can create the test cases and we can prepare the penetration test cases document. So this is one of the sample, and this is only for reference purpose. Okay, next, penetration test cases, where can be followed and benefit of the penetration test cases. To be followed, when we execute the penetration test for any web based application, REST APIs or SOAP APIs, mobile application, embedded devices or OT devices, cloud solutions, IoT systems, network devices, infrastructure. When we do the penetration test, it is best practice the test cases to be followed, and we need to execute the penetration test cases. Then the benefit of the penetration test cases. Suppose if we follow the penetration test cases document, it will be useful to share with the customers for confirmation purpose. It will be useful to share the any security agencies to get any compliance or security certificate clearance. It will be useful to share any internal or external auditor. It will be useful to share with the quality team and get further approvals for the delivery. It will be useful to use any security engineers, and you can execute the test cases by following the test steps. And the requirements versus the test cases traceability. Example, how many test cases are passed, how many test cases are failed. Based on these test cases results, how many requirements are passed, how many security requirements are failed. All these details we can create the traceability for further reference purpose. So this is the basic and overview about the penetration test cases. Suppose if you have any clarifications on this topic, you can give your clarification details in the comment section. I will see you in next session. Bye.